Ace King is a nice hand, and we mostly 3-bet it from most positions. However, when we don't hit anything, it can get difficult to play the hand, even though it's very nice and powerful pre-flop. And in this hand, we will go through a process of figuring out what to do when you don't hit anything and who would be better suited, as an example, than Linus Love, maybe the best player who exists right now. He 3-bets from the big blind, facing a hijack open from Moonestar, who calls, and the flop is 10 high, so we don't hit anything here, and the flop most of the time isn't the biggest problem because you mostly don't make a big mistake if you c-bet your hand, and in this occasion I would think that is the case as well. Here we are in the big blind, we have a strong range. 3-betting against a hijack open usually happens, or in GTO happens, with a quite strong range, also quite polarized. However, we mostly call our we mostly call the hands that we continue here facing a raise. So those hands that we 3-bet are usually some of the best, probably jacks and better, probably jacks even mixed in some calls here pre-flop. So it's mostly queens and better. Ace king will also sometimes just flat here. Actually, I don't think the suited versions flat here, but I would think that the offsuited ones don't 3-bet all the time. And then, of course, you also add in some bluffs that are usually a little bit weaker. But the range that we get here to this flop with includes quite some heavy amount of overpairs, relatively seen. So queens plus will be a rather big part of our range here. So that will be the first process you want to go through in your head. What does our range look like? What does our opponent's range look like? They will have less aces, less kings, probably also less queens. However, queens, maybe they might be on par with our range actually. However, their range or their overpairs are mostly queens and worse, and ours are queens and better. So here, c-betting will likely be a good play with most of our range, just because we have such a big advantage here. And that is what Linus does. Half pot seems like a good sizing, just because we don't want to go too small. It's not like we have a huge range advantage here. It's more like we have an overpair advantage, which is close to a nut advantage. Of course, nuts will be probably exclusively pocket tens here, which we likely don't 3-bet at all. So overpairs are the next best hand class that any player basically can have here, because there's not going to be any 2 pairs here. Nobody will play 10-3 suited in the 3-bet pot. Also, deuces and threes will likely not even open here. If they do, they likely don't call a 3-bet. They don't call a 3-bet pre-flop. And so queens and better will be as close to the nuts that we could have here. And if that is the case, then we likely want to go with a bigger size. So not a 1/3 size, but half pot or even bigger. Here Linus goes with half pot, and we get called. So here we still have everything going for us. Of course, we can get a fold if we c-bet here. We can hit a king or an ace on the turn. We can also hit a jack or a queen, which gives us a little bit more equity, so we can barrel. We can even get called by worse hands, so ace queen of spades, ace 5 suited, or we can barrel on the turn and then win the pot over there. The turn is a 5, and now we're in a little bit of a tricky spot, in a sense of what do we do here? We already bet the flop. What do we do on the turn? We could, of course, barrel. We still have overcards. We still have a gut shot. We have turned the gut shot actually. So we have additional outs that can make us a straight. At the same time, our opponent likely has 2 or 3 kinds of hands, let's say it. Tens plus, which will basically never fold against the barrel. They could have, so that category belongs in the hands that are better than ours and won't fold. Then they can have hands like 9s through 6s, which are hands that are technically better than ours and have more equity, but they might be able to fold. 6s probably less so, but 7s through 9s could definitely fold here against the barrel, but they might not do as well. So those are hands that are better than ours and they might fold. And then the third category is hands that we are even ahead of. So those would be hands like floats with ace queen, ace jack with a backdoor flush draw. Maybe some flush draws, some pure flush draws like king queen, king jack, queen jack, maybe even if that calls pre-flop. So basically hands that we are ahead of. And if they have a flush draw, they likely won't fold against the barrel. But if it's ace queen of spades, for example, or ace jack of spades, then they would fold against the barrel. But at the same time, we are already ahead of them. So we don't gain that much by folding them out. So what do we do here? That will be the biggest question. Linus decides to bet, and he gets a fold. But now let's go ahead and see what we could we can find in the solver, and if we can take away some concepts that we can use at the table whenever we are in a similar spot at the tables ourselves. So we do 3-bet here. Yeah, as mentioned, jacks actually fold purely here, and queens also sometimes call here against an open raise pre-flop. Kings and aces always 3-bet. Ace king suited 3-bets all the time, and then ace king off mixes, just as assumed. And then we have a bunch of suited cards, broadways, and a few ace x suited hands that 3-bet as well, some suited connectors as well, and then some very few off-suited ace-x hands that also 3-bet. So quite polarized, and that makes sense for the big blind against the hijack. The hijack then goes ahead, calls even most pocket kings here, so not even kings would 4-bet, which likely won't happen as much in practice. Kings will likely 4-bet more often than only 27% of the time, which would be the GTO solution. You might even see some more 4-bets with ace king. However, these days these hands actually call quite a lot in my experience. Aces, I would rather bet that there was 4-bet closer to 100% of the time. Definitely not flatting 22% of the time. I would definitely bet that. And on data shows that as well, actually. I don't remember the exact number, but in my pre-flop exploits course, I covered that as well. And aces definitely 4-bets more often than only 77% of the time. Pocket pairs, 10s start folding here, and then all the way down to pocket 5s, 4s, 3s. The folding frequency increases here. Also, we see queen jack, king jack are hands that are folding. When it comes to Broadway hands, ace 9, ace 5 purely calls, and then a few of these lower aces can 4-bet sometimes. So this calling range is also quite tight here. Now let's go ahead and quickly solve the tree. We have 28.5 big blinds, and then 127 in stacks. For the big blind, we saw Linus bets 50, so we'll just use the 51. For imposition, we don't need one. We can just go with the automatic one, and then on the turn, Linus's sizing here is actually 61%, so we will use that and only use that. Well, no, let's actually check. No, not forces check. Let's see if the solver would use a different sizing as well. 100, and see if any of those are used. For imposition, we can again use the automatic one, and that's already it. The flop is 10-3 deuce. And here we see, excuse me, a very frequent bet on the flop, 80% of the time. So basically the hands that don't want to bet here or want to bet here less often than they want to check are these 9x hands that don't have a backdoor flush draw or a direct flush draw, as well as some of these pseudo connectors that also don't have any draws here. Even the backdoor flush draws check most of the time. And then, yeah, some other ace-x hands without a backdoor flush draw. These are just too weak to bet. And if those want to be in the checking range, then we also need to slow play some other hands that are in the checking range. However, we can see that these hands here, ace king, but also aces, kings, and queens, mostly want to bet here. So ace king is in the betting category almost all the time. So again, because our range is quite strong, we can bet ace king as well as a bluff, which also has the benefit of getting caught by weaker hands even and having a lot of outs against hands that are ahead of us. Imposition would not have a raising range here, but still calls 72% of the time, which isn't a very low number. So that shows that their range is already quite tight to begin with. And the hands that would fold are hands that don't have any equity here whatsoever. So overcards, of course, that is a little bit of equity, but no backdoor flush draw is not enough to continue, especially a hand like king queen here. If you imagine, we just saw we would bet ace king here a lot of the time as the big blind, so calling king queen is even worse, especially without a backdoor draw. And then we see that even the pocket pairs that don't have a heart, so no backdoor flush draw, always fold already on the flop, which is also a good reason for our ace king to bet here, because those hands are actually ahead of our hand on the flop. And if they fold, if we get them to fold, then that's a big win for our ace king. And the reason they can just fold, even though we have so many ace kings in our betting range, is just that these hands are toast against our overpairs. And of course, they are also in a bad shape whenever some overcards hit on the turn and the river, then they have very little chance of winning the hand. Because they are just behind most of the time, and even if they don't, they can't really call off three barrels on, let's say, any queen and then any random card on the river. So they already fold on the flop. Now let's go ahead and look at the turn, which was a 5 of clubs. And I have the assumption that ace king would mix here a lot, which is why it feels so difficult to actually pull off the correct strategy in practice. Because if you see your hand is mixing here, checking 40% of the time and then betting the rest, you basically never make a mistake, but you probably always make a mistake because you don't hit the exact frequency over time. You usually default to either always betting it or never betting it. Of course, I'm not saying everybody is doing that. Some people do actually randomize here and maybe get closer to the actual betting frequency. But it is not easy to find the correct strategy if your hand is mixing. That is just humanly, that is just part of being human, right? So first of all, let's have a look at the betting sizes for our range. So 61% is the most frequent size here compared to these other ones. So let's just simplify the tree and only have us bet 61%. That way we have an easier time discussing it. So here still ace king is mostly mixing. For the offsuit combos, we can see that ace of hearts always wants to bet. So that is something that is good to know. Also, king of hearts bets most of the time. So you could already say if I have a heart here when I have ace king off, I could probably barrel all the time. Whereas if I don't have one, I could probably check it all the time. However, for the offsuit, for the suited combos, that looks much different. Even ace king of hearts does mix 60-40 checking and betting. So what can we do with this? So what I want to try today is seeing what changes if we play a pure strategy with our hand here. So instead of assuming or thinking I can implement this exact mixing strategy in game, let's see what happens if we always bet ace king, if we always check ace king. What does that mean for our EV? And also what does that mean for our opponent's strategy that they would have to play? First of all, we'll duplicate the tree here so we can experiment a little bit. And first of all, we will assume our opponent. Oh no, let's start with just node locking our hand's frequency. So let's go ahead and say we bet ace king all the time, suited and offsuited. Lock it. So here we can actually lock the previous nodes, so everything that happens on the flop should stay as it is. Otherwise, we could see a difference in flop play as well. I'm not sure actually if GTO Wizard does that. Pure Solver does definitely do that. For GTO Wizard, I think they solve street for street, so might not even have an impact here, but let's just make sure everything that happens before this node stays the same. So now we went from betting 53% of the time to 62 just by changing the frequency with ace king, which is quite a big impact, right? Yeah, only changing ace king and our overall betting frequency increases by that much. And now when we bet, let's have a look at how our opponent would have to play. This is if we always bet ace king. And this is the strategy if we mix it according to the equilibrium frequency. We can already see the biggest impact is the raising frequency. So in the GTO solution, 14% of the time they would have to raise and 29% of the time they could fold their hand. If we always barrel ace king, they would have to raise us 37% of the time and only be able to fold 18% of the time. So much more investment on their side that would be necessary. And now let's have a look at what exactly changes. We can do that by clicking on this button. So we have the original simulation on the right and the adjusted one on the left. So already we'll see that queens would mostly just jam it in here. I think it's a jam. Yeah, exactly. Jacks would almost always jam. in equilibrium, jacks would even start folding here. So that is a huge difference. Tens basically stays the same. And then these pocket pairs start calling a little bit. So in GTO, we see actually that 9s through 7s always fold. I thought they might start folding, as I said, but I didn't expect them to already fold 100% of the time. And then for aces and kings, it's not actually that big of a difference because these hands already raise a lot in the GTO solution. However, the other type of hands that would raise more often are flush draws. So ace jack of hearts, ace 10 already raises in GTO, ace 9 of hearts, ace 8 of hearts, ace 5 of diamonds, interestingly. Might be because we block ace 10 of diamonds. Would have to look into our big blinds barreling strategy. But let's simplify it and say that overpairs and flush draws simply raise much more often. King queen we also see here without the flush draw because we unblock flush draws, which helps us with our equity when we jam. Also in GTO 10-9 of hearts would only raise here as an exploit. These diamonds and club combos also never fold, which they mostly do in GTO. So big impact here as well. So it's basically 10x and better pairs raise a lot more often and flush draws. And if our opponent does that, then our equity goes from 28.39 to only 27.48. So a big difference, almost one big blind that we make less if we always barrel ace king and our opponent adjusts perfectly. However, I don't know about you, but I think that does not happen exactly like this all the time. You might have opponents who are very aggressive and jam on you a lot. So it's not like this strategy is impossible for anyone to play. But if that does not happen, then let's have a look at how that impacts our strategy. So let's have a look at what happens if we lock our opponent's GTO strategy against the turn barrel, and if we increase our barrels with ace king. So we lock their reaction against the barrel. They still play the same strategy as they would in GTO. And now we allow ourselves to always barrel ace king and see what happens if our opponent doesn't adjust against that. All right, so again, we have our strategy always barreling ace king. Everything else stays the same. And facing a barrel, oh no, sorry, we know their strategy. I just wanted to look at the EV. So here it's 28.16 compared to an equilibrium strategy of 28.39. So around 0.2 big blinds in EV that we make less, which is a slight difference, but it's way less than the almost one big blind that we make less whenever our opponent does adjust. Which means if we have an opponent who does not expect us to always barrel ace king and adjusts perfectly, or they simply play this strategy which is not as raise heavy, then we barely lose any money by barreling ace king always. So we can actually calculate the amount of the pot. So it's 0.2 of a, how big is the pot actually? 57.1 big blinds. Whoops, sorry. 57.1. So times 100, that is 0.34%. So we lose out on 0.3% of the pot, which is way less than 1% of the pot, which is still way less than 0.5% of the pot. So not a huge deal actually if we expect our opponent to not perfectly adjust. Which means in practice, always betting ace king likely does not lose you that much money. If, for example, you had a reason to assume your opponent calls more often with these hands that are supposed to raise, then it might not even be costing you any money at all. But let's have a look at that and simulate what happens if they just call more often. So let's say they call 75% of the time with pocket kings, and they also slow play aces 75% of the time. I'm not sure about ace king. I can't. Not sure how I can look at the combos right now. Everything is still new in this in this node lock UI. Used to be different. Also ace 10. Let's say they slow play ace king, ace 10. I'm sorry, way more often. And then let's just assume they play these hands close to GTO. Yeah, let's leave it at that. Just a little bit more passively, and whoops, no, yeah, I want to lock this and have a look at what an impact that makes for our range. So we already saw that the EV went up again. Again, this is the equilibrium EV for us, 28.39. If we assume our opponent to play a little bit more passively than GTO even, then our EV goes up a little bit more. So now it's only 0.06 big blinds that we make less by always barreling ace king, which is quite close to GTO. It's basically the same frequency, the same EV. However, that again assumes our opponent might play a little bit more passively. Right, so what do we learn? Our opponent needs to be extremely aggressive in order for us to make a mistake by always barreling ace king here. If that is not the case, then we can pretty much simplify our lives and always bet it instead of having to rely on finding the right mixing frequency. And one last thing we can do here is let's see what happens if our opponent is very aggressive and what we can do to exploit that. So let's say our opponent always plays a very aggressive strategy for whatever reason. Either they just think that is the right play, or they think in the perfect GTO world, let's assume they readjust against our strategy, thinking we always barrel ace king, and they play this aggressive strategy against the barrel. So let's lock this strategy and then have a look at what our best strategy as the big blind would be if we expect our opponent to be that aggressive. For that, we just unlock all the hands and then rerun it. So now, if we expect our opponent to be that much more aggressive, then already the first thing we can see is we don't want to barrel ace king as often, which makes sense because their counter strategy would be against us barreling ace king too often. So if they play that strategy, then we would want to reduce our barrels here. Ace king with the ace of hearts is still good enough to barrel. So that is something that is always worth noting. That's why node locks are so important, because if you adjust a little bit to your opponent being more aggressive, a little bit more passive, you can still see which hands still want to barrel. So ace king of hearts is still good enough to barrel even if our opponent is more aggressive than they should be. So barreling these hands is basically always a good idea. However, anything else, even the king of hearts, is a pure check now, as with all hands that do not contain a heart at all. Still, aces, kings barrel quite a lot, so let's just quickly compare that to the equilibrium strategy. Everything barrels a little bit less often, but still, if we look at the hand class distributions, we'll see that overpairs still bet most of the time and are decreasing their frequency the least. Everything else here goes back much more. So especially hands like ace king, ace king, ace high, ace king, ace high, king high, and queen high. That's what I want to say. These hands probably decrease their frequencies the most, which makes sense because if they're getting jammed on much more often than in GTO, then they lose out on the most EV by betting. So if that is the case, you basically just want to make your range, your betting range, much more value heavy. And that happens mostly by still betting your overpairs and cutting back on a lot of bets with weaker hands. We can still have a look at which hands do want to barrel. 5 of hearts, so ace 5 with ace 5 of hearts basically, 6 5 of hearts, and then also ace 5 with the ace of hearts is still good enough. Some other combos as well, but mainly the same principle holds true, that having the ace of hearts is very good here for barreling, just because, as we saw, our opponent would jam a lot of ace x of hearts here, and if you have the ace of hearts, you will not get jammed on as often and lose the pot because you have to fold. Also, these hands can pretty much call off any raise, and that's why barreling them is not a bad idea, even if our opponent jams on us much more often. Same goes for ace jack here, ace of hearts. Ace queen, interestingly, is good enough to barrel still without any draws. Might be because it still blocks pocket queens in our opponent's range, which is a big part of their jamming range. Yep. But yeah, I think that is one of the most important, or those are some of the most important learnings we can take from this. If we expect our opponent to adjust perfectly, then of course always barreling ace king is not a good idea. But if they do not play as aggressively, then we can get away with just barreling it all the time. If we expect our opponent to be very aggressive against the bet, then we want to cut it back a lot. Check ace king most of the time. Just reduce your barrels, your bluff barrels, to hands that can call off a jam. For example, if we have a pair and a flush draw. If we block flush draws, which make up a big part of our opponent's jamming range, or if we simply have value hands like queens and better and can call off a jam with a value hand. All right, I hope that was helpful. Let me know what you think, and I'll see you in the next one.